Imagine a queen who refused to bow down to one of the most powerful empires of her time. A woman who stood at the crossroads of African resistance against the brutal machine of slavery. Her name was Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, and her story is not just one of royalty, but of defiance, diplomacy, and an unshakable fight for freedom. In the early 1600s, as Portuguese colonizers expanded their grip on Central Africa, enslaving thousands to fuel the transatlantic trade, one woman rose to stand in their way. Nzinga was no ordinary ruler. She was a strategist, a negotiator, and a warrior who would not only challenge the Portuguese crown, but reshape the fate of her people. From entering negotiations with colonial powers in ways that stunned her enemies, to leading armies on the battlefield, Nzinga became a symbol of resistance in a time when slavery was devouring Africa. But Nzinga's legacy is more than just warfare. It is the story of survival, of political brilliance, of a woman who turned her very life into a shield for her nation. This is not just history. This is a tale of courage that echoes into today. Stay with us as we uncover the untold story of Queen Nzinga, Africa's anti-slavery icon. The 16th and 17th centuries marked one of the darkest turning points in human history. Across the oceans, empires were expanding, seeking wealth, land, and control. For Africa, this age would come to be defined by one word: slavery. On the western coast of Central Africa lay the Kingdom of Ndongo, a land of rolling plains, rich river valleys, and bustling trade routes. Here, societies had thrived for generations. They cultivated crops, built fortified settlements, and established complex political systems. Kings and queens ruled with councils of nobles, while warriors defended their territories from rivals. But beneath this vibrant way of life, a storm was gathering. By the late 1500s, the Portuguese had established their presence along the African coast. What began as trade for ivory, spices, and gold quickly turned into a relentless hunt for human lives. Portuguese ships, armed with cannons and greed, roamed the shores in search of captives. The transatlantic slave trade was expanding, and Angola, the region that included Ndongo and Matamba, became one of its main suppliers. The numbers were staggering. By the early 1600s, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were being ripped from their homes each year, chained and shipped across the Atlantic to labor on sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. Each person represented not just a life lost, but a family torn apart, a culture disrupted, a future erased. The Portuguese did not act alone. They often relied on alliances with local African rulers, who, under pressure or in pursuit of power, became complicit in the trade. Yet, many resisted. For them, the slave trade was not just foreign exploitation, it was a direct attack on their sovereignty, their people, and their survival. In this volatile world, the Kingdom of Ndongo was caught in a brutal tug-of-war. On one side stood the Portuguese, backed by European weaponry and global networks of trade. On the other stood African rulers, struggling to defend their lands from raids and manipulation. It was here, in the midst of this struggle, that a remarkable figure would emerge. Her name was Nzinga Mbande. Born into the royal family of Ndongo around 1583, she entered a world where every decision could mean the difference between survival and destruction. From an early age, Nzinga was exposed to the brutal realities of slavery and war. She saw how Portuguese merchants enriched themselves by trafficking her people. She witnessed the vulnerability of African states in the face of European expansion. And she understood that if her kingdom was to survive, it would require more than armies. It would require cunning, courage, and unshakable resolve. This was the world into which Nzinga rose, a land rich in culture, but overshadowed by the looming shadow of slavery. A land where betrayal and survival walked hand in hand, and a land that would soon come to know her not just as a queen, but as a warrior, a strategist, and a defiant icon of resistance. The story of Queen Nzinga begins here, in the crucible of colonial expansion and human suffering. To understand her fight, we must first understand the era that demanded her courage. Nzinga Mbande was born in 1583 into the royal household of the Kingdom of Ndongo in what is today Angola. Her father, King Colombo Kia Ndambi, ruled at a time when Portuguese influence was tightening its grip on the region. From her earliest days, Nzinga's life was marked by both privilege and danger. Privilege as a princess in one of Central Africa's proudest kingdoms, and danger because her people stood in the direct path of Portuguese expansion and the insatiable hunger for slaves. Her very name carried meaning. Nzinga comes from a word in Kimbundu, the language of her people, meaning to twist or to turn. It was said she was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, a sign her elders believed that she would grow to be a resilient and resourceful leader, able to bend with fate but never break. That symbolism would follow her throughout her life. Unlike many young women of her time, Nzinga was not kept away from matters of state. Her father recognized her intelligence early and ensured she received training not only in the skills expected of noble women, ceremony, tradition, and diplomacy, but also in the arts of governance, negotiation, and even warfare. She often accompanied him to council meetings, where she listened intently as generals and advisors discussed strategies for defending the kingdom against raids. She absorbed the rhythms of politics as easily as other children learned songs. Her youth was spent in a kingdom under siege. Portuguese slavers were constantly pushing inland, demanding tribute, alliances, or outright submission. Each raid carried away men, women, and children from villages nearby, and Nzinga saw firsthand the anguish of mothers wailing for children who would never return. These memories etched themselves deeply into her heart, instilling both anger and resolve. Her siblings also shaped her world. She had brothers and sisters, but her most significant relationship was with her father, who treated her as an equal to her male siblings in matters of strategy. Oral tradition holds that Nzinga was skilled with words and possessed a commanding presence even as a girl. When she spoke, others listened. When she argued, she could change minds. By her teenage years, she was already proving herself as more than just a royal daughter. She was sent as a representative on minor diplomatic missions, learning how to negotiate with neighboring tribes. She quickly developed a reputation for sharp intelligence, unshaken composure, and a keen ability to read her opponents. These skills would later make her legendary. But the royal household was not free from internal rivalries. Her brother, Angola Mbande, would eventually ascend to the throne after their father's death, and his reign was troubled by Portuguese pressure and political instability. Nzinga, however, was not content to remain in the background. She became his trusted advisor and often his envoy. It was during this time that her abilities began to eclipse those of many seasoned leaders. Nzinga's early years were not without hardship. Portuguese sources record that she may have been captured during a raid in her youth, though if so, she was later freed or ransomed back to her family. Whether fact or legend, such stories underscored her deep connection to the suffering of her people. Unlike rulers who grew distant from the lives of ordinary villagers, Nzinga never forgot the pain caused by the slave trade. She also witnessed how divided loyalties could destroy African kingdoms. Some leaders, desperate to hold on to power, allied with the Portuguese and supplied captives in exchange for guns and goods. Others resisted and were crushed. Nzinga saw clearly that survival required not only strength but flexibility, the ability to bend and adapt without breaking. By the time she reached adulthood, Nzinga was more than just a royal princess. She was a leader in waiting, armed with knowledge, resilience, and a fierce determination. She had learned that diplomacy could be as powerful as the sword, that appearances mattered in the theater of power, and that survival meant being willing to twist and turn without ever surrendering. These lessons from her childhood and youth prepared her for the challenges ahead. The stage was being set for her most famous moment, the 1622 encounter with the Portuguese governor, where she would cement her place in history as not just a princess of Ndongo, but as a woman destined to become queen. When the Portuguese first arrived on the coasts of Central Africa in the late 15th century, they came as traders. Their ships carried cloth, beads, guns, and iron tools, which they exchanged for ivory, spices, and precious metals. But very quickly, their ambitions shifted. What they desired most was not goods, but people. By the late 1500s, Angola had become one of the largest sources of enslaved Africans for the transatlantic trade. Portuguese ships anchored at Luanda and Benguela turned into processing hubs where human beings were loaded like cargo, bound for Brazil, the Caribbean, and Europe. Over the next 3 centuries, more than 4 million Africans would be taken from Angola alone. The demand was endless, and the brutality required to sustain it was merciless. The Portuguese used every strategy at their disposal. They built fortified outposts along the coast, established alliances with local leaders who supplied captives, and launched devastating military campaigns against kingdoms that resisted. Villages were raided without warning. Men were slaughtered if they resisted, women and children dragged off in chains. In the kingdom of Ndongo, where Nzinga was born, the threat was constant. Portuguese soldiers and their African allies, known as Imbandes, raided deep into the interior. They captured thousands, destabilizing entire regions. Families lived with the daily fear that their loved ones might be taken at any moment. The Portuguese were not only after captives, they sought control. Their ultimate goal was to transform Angola into a colony that served Portugal's empire. To achieve this, they used the strategy of divide and rule. They offered gifts, guns, and promises of protection to certain chiefs, while sowing distrust among rival groups. This created a cycle of dependency. Leaders who collaborated grew temporarily stronger, but became reliant on Portuguese weapons. Those who resisted found themselves isolated, vulnerable to raids, and eventually destroyed. The Portuguese crown also used religion as a tool. Missionaries spread Catholicism, urging African rulers to convert, promising them legitimacy in the eyes of Europe if they embraced Christianity. For some, conversion was a pragmatic choice, a way to secure fragile alliances. For others, it was a bitter compromise, an acceptance of foreign influence in exchange for survival. By the early 1600s, Ndongo was under enormous pressure. The kingdom's power was waning, its population shrinking, its resources drained. The ruling family, including Nzinga's brother Angola Mbande, faced impossible decisions. Should they fight, knowing their armies were outgunned by Portuguese muskets and cannons? Should they negotiate, hoping to buy peace through concessions? Or should they risk alliances with the same foreign powers who were tearing their people apart? This was the world Nzinga inherited, a world where every treaty came with betrayal, every negotiation with a trap, every battle with devastating losses. The Portuguese did not see her people as equals, they saw them as commodities. To the empire in Lisbon, Angola was nothing more than a reservoir of labor, feeding Brazil's sugar plantations and enriching the crown. But the Portuguese underestimated something. In their arrogance, they assumed conquest would be swift. They did not anticipate leaders like Nzinga, who would study their tactics, learn their weaknesses, and fight back with strategies they could not predict. In 1622, the Portuguese invited Ndongo's royal court to Luanda to negotiate peace. By then, the kingdom had been battered by war and slave raids. Thousands of its people had been captured and sold overseas. Its king, Nzinga's brother, was desperate for a solution. But it was not he who stepped forward to face the governor of Angola. It was Nzinga. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary, one that would show the Portuguese that the daughter of Ndongo was no ordinary princess. She was about to turn diplomacy into a weapon as sharp as any blade. The year was 1622. The kingdom of Ndongo was on the edge of collapse. Portuguese raids combined with betrayals from neighboring chiefs had weakened the state. Thousands of Ndongo's people were being dragged in chains to Luanda and shipped across the Atlantic. King Angola Mbande, Nzinga's brother, was desperate for peace. The Portuguese governor summoned the royal court to negotiate. The invitation itself was a test of power. The Portuguese wanted to demonstrate their dominance by forcing African leaders to come on their terms in their city under their gaze. Many feared the journey, believing it might be a trap. But Nzinga, already known as her brother's sharpest advisor, insisted on going. The chair incident. When Nzinga arrived in Luanda, she was received with pomp, but also with subtle insults. The Portuguese governor sat on a throne-like chair towering over his visitors. For Nzinga, however, no seat was provided. This was deliberate, a reminder that in the eyes of the colonizers, she was not an equal, but a supplicant. But Nzinga would not bow to humiliation. Calmly, she gestured to one of her attendants, who immediately knelt on the ground, forming a seat with his body. Nzinga sat proudly upon him, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the governor's. In that single act, she delivered a message more powerful than words. I will not kneel before you. I meet you as an equal or not at all. This moment became legendary, a symbol of dignity in the face of arrogance. The Portuguese had tried to diminish her, but instead, she had turned the encounter into a demonstration of strength. The negotiation. Nzinga's diplomatic brilliance stunned her enemies. She listened carefully, responded with measured confidence, and maneuvered the conversation to secure major concessions. The Portuguese agreed to withdraw some troops, recognize her brother as ruler, and, at least on paper, limit slave raiding. To seal the alliance, Nzinga converted to Christianity, taking the name Dona Ana de Sousa after the governor's wife. To the Portuguese, this was a victory. They believed she had embraced their faith. But Nzinga's conversion was a political move, a way to gain legitimacy and buy time. She understood the theater of power and used it to protect her people. From princess to queen, despite her success, the peace was fragile. The Portuguese soon broke their promises, resuming raids. King Golambande, humiliated and powerless, fell into despair. According to historical accounts, he took his own life in 1624. His death left the kingdom vulnerable and opened the path for Nzinga. Though succession was contested, Nzinga maneuvered with the same skill she had shown in diplomacy. She consolidated power, outsmarting rivals and silencing those who doubted a woman's right to rule. Within a year, she was crowned Queen of Ndongo, a different kind of ruler. As queen, Nzinga shattered expectations. In a patriarchal society, women were rarely seen as military commanders. Yet, Nzinga took the field herself, dressed in armor, leading troops into battle. She recruited former slaves and exiles into her armies, promising them freedom and land if they fought at her side. She welcomed fugitives from Portuguese captivity, giving them sanctuary and forging a new community bound by survival and resistance. Nzinga also understood the importance of alliances. She reached out to neighboring African states, seeking common cause against Portuguese domination. Later, she would even align with the Dutch, rivals of Portugal, turning European conflicts into opportunities for African survival, symbol of defiance. Her rise was not simply about taking a throne, it was about rewriting the rules. Nzinga proved that leadership did not depend on gender, that African rulers could outwit European powers, and that dignity could survive even in an age defined by enslavement. In the decades to come, she would lead her people through endless cycles of war and negotiation. She would adapt, twist, and turn, just as her name foretold. But it was here, in the early 1620s, that her legend was born. A woman who would not kneel, a queen who transformed humiliation into triumph, and a leader who carried the hopes of a people on her shoulders. Nzinga had risen, and the Portuguese were about to learn that she was no ordinary opponent. When Nzinga took the throne of Ndongo in 1624, she inherited not a stable kingdom, but one on the brink of collapse. Her brother's death had left deep political wounds. Portuguese forces and their African allies continued to raid, enslaving thousands. Rival claimants questioned her legitimacy. Many doubted whether a woman could rule in such violent times. But Nzinga was no ordinary ruler. If the Portuguese thought she would be easily defeated, they were wrong. She transformed her kingdom into a fortress of resistance, not through brute force alone, but through cunning, adaptability, and strategies that made her one of the most remarkable leaders of the 17th century. Guerrilla warfare. The Portuguese had muskets, cannons, and fortified settlements, but Nzinga had the land. She knew the terrain of Angola, the rivers, forests, and hills, far better than any European. Rather than confronting the Portuguese head-on in large battles, Nzinga employed guerrilla tactics. Her soldiers would strike quickly, ambush convoys, and disappear into the forests before the Portuguese could retaliate. Supply lines were cut, outposts harassed, and enemy troops exhausted. What the Portuguese expected to be a swift conquest turned into a drawn-out struggle. Building an army of the dispossessed, Nzinga recognized that resistance required people, and the Portuguese had left countless displaced Africans in their wake. She offered freedom and sanctuary to escaped slaves, refugees, and even criminals if they pledged loyalty. These new recruits had every reason to fight fiercely: survival, revenge, and the hope of a new life. Nzinga turned her capital into a safe haven for the oppressed. Over time, this policy created a multicultural army, not just Ndongo warriors, but people from across Central Africa united under her leadership. Alliances with neighbors. Nzinga knew she could not resist alone. She reached out to neighboring kingdoms, forging fragile but crucial alliances. She appealed not just to rulers' self-interest, but to their sense of survival. If Ndongo fell, their lands would be next. Some alliances were sealed through diplomacy, others through marriage, and still others through calculated displays of strength. Her ability to navigate this complex web of African politics was as impressive as her battlefield victories. Christianity as strategy. To many, Nzinga's conversion to Christianity in 1622 seemed like submission, but she wielded religion as a weapon. By adopting the name Dona Ana de Sousa and presenting herself as a Christian queen, she gained legitimacy in the eyes of Europeans, securing valuable pauses in hostilities. At the same time, she continued to practice traditional African rituals, honoring the gods and ancestors of her people. She walked a delicate line, using faith as diplomacy without abandoning her roots. In a world where European powers equated Christianity with civilization, Nzinga cleverly played the role expected of her, but always on her terms. The Matamba transformation. In the 1630s, when Portuguese pressure became unbearable, Nzinga relocated her base of power from Ndongo to the neighboring kingdom of Matamba. There, she rebuilt her authority, reorganized her army, and transformed Matamba into a thriving state. Matamba became both a sanctuary and a launchpad for resistance. Nzinga integrated it fully into her political project, turning it into a hub of trade, sometimes even trading with the Portuguese themselves when it served her advantage. This dual role of warrior and merchant allowed her to sustain her fight for decades. Alliance with the Dutch. In 1641, fortune seemed to favor her cause. The Dutch seized Luanda from the Portuguese, and Nzinga quickly allied with them. She offered military support, hoping the Dutch would weaken Portuguese power permanently. For a time, this alliance worked. Nzinga's armies, fighting alongside Dutch forces, struck major blows against the Portuguese. Though the Dutch would eventually retreat, leaving Nzinga to face her enemies alone once more, the alliance showed her brilliance in exploiting European rivalries. She understood global politics better than many kings in Europe, and used it to keep her people alive. Ruthless determination. Nzinga was admired by many, but feared by just as many. To maintain control, she could be ruthless. Rivals who challenged her were eliminated. Discipline in her army was strict. She even adopted practices that shocked European observers, such as surrounding herself with a loyal guard drawn from the ranks of former slaves. To her enemies, these actions painted her as cruel. To her supporters, they were proof of her unyielding will to survive. In an age of betrayal and enslavement, weakness meant death, and Nzinga refused to bow. Legacy of resistance. What made Nzinga's strategies extraordinary was her ability to adapt. She was not bound by tradition or dogma. She used diplomacy when necessary, religion when useful, and war when unavoidable. She twisted and turned, just as her name foretold, to keep her people free for as long as possible. Her resistance spanned more than 4 decades. Few leaders in Africa or anywhere else in the world fought European colonizers for so long and with such resilience. Nzinga's strategies turned her from a threatened queen into a living legend. She proved that even in an age where European empires seemed unstoppable, African leaders could still defy, outwit, and outlast them. The Portuguese may have captured thousands, but they could never capture her spirit. And as her reputation grew, so too did her enemies' fear. For Nzinga was no longer just the queen of Ndongo or Matamba. She had become the symbol of African resistance itself. By the mid-1630s, Queen Nzinga had weathered years of war, betrayal, and shifting alliances. She had endured exile, rebuilt her armies, and forged new strategies of resistance. Yet her legacy was not shaped by war alone. Nzinga was more than a battlefield commander. She was a ruler who transformed her kingdom into a functioning state that could withstand the relentless pressures of colonialism. Rebuilding in Matamba. After relentless Portuguese campaigns weakened Ndongo, Nzinga shifted her capital to Matamba, a neighboring kingdom she seized and consolidated under her control. This was not a retreat, but a rebirth. Matamba had fertile lands, strategic trade routes, and a strong warrior tradition. From here, Nzinga reconstructed her power base and gave her people stability. Unlike many rulers who saw subjects merely as tools of war, Nzinga prioritized rebuilding communities. She resettled displaced families, gave land to freed captives, and welcomed runaways from Portuguese territory. Matamba soon became a haven for the oppressed, a place where freedom could still be defended. Law, order, and discipline. Nzinga's rule was marked by strict discipline. She understood that survival required unity, and unity required order. Oral histories describe her as a just but demanding leader. Her armies followed rigorous codes with harsh punishments for betrayal or desertion. But justice extended beyond the battlefield. Nzinga worked to stabilize the economy, ensuring resources were distributed to sustain her people even in times of war. Her court blended traditional African governance with lessons drawn from European contact. She incorporated councils of advisors, but final authority remained firmly in her hands. Decisions were made swiftly, often with her direct involvement. In a patriarchal society, Nzinga's command shocked many, yet few dared challenge her, for she had already proven her strength countless times. Trade and diplomacy. Though she resisted Portuguese domination, Nzinga did not reject commerce. She understood that trade was essential to power. Under her rule, Matamba became a key trading hub in Central Africa. Caravans moved goods, ivory, textiles, livestock, and occasionally even captives across vast routes. Yes, Nzinga sometimes engaged in the slave trade herself. This reality complicates her legacy, but it reflects the brutal choices leaders faced. For Nzinga, participation in limited slave trading was a way to acquire firearms and maintain diplomatic leverage. In her eyes, survival of her kingdom required pragmatism, even if it meant navigating moral contradictions. Her ability to negotiate with Europeans, including both the Portuguese and Dutch, showed her diplomatic genius. She played rivals against each other, striking deals when they suited her, breaking them when they did not. To the Portuguese, she was unpredictable. To her people, she was resourceful. A woman on the throne. Nzinga's gender was one of the most striking aspects of her reign. In a world dominated by male rulers, she defied expectations. Oral traditions speak of her donning armor, leading troops, and issuing orders like any king. Some accounts even suggest she adopted male titles or surrounded herself with female warriors to reinforce her authority. Her reign challenged gender norms in Central Africa. While other queens existed in African history, Nzinga's prominence and longevity made her exceptional. She proved that leadership was not bound to gender, but to vision, courage, and skill. Cultural influence. Nzinga was not only a political leader, but also a cultural symbol. She sponsored traditional ceremonies, upheld spiritual practices, and blended them with her Christian identity when it served her strategy. In doing so, she created a unique cultural identity for her court, one that honored both African traditions and the realities of European presence. Her resilience inspired songs, stories, and oral histories that outlived her. For many, she was more than a queen. She was a protector chosen by the ancestors, a living embodiment of resistance. Balancing war and governance. Perhaps Nzinga's greatest achievement as a ruler was her ability to balance war with governance. Unlike many leaders consumed by conflict, she built systems that allowed her people to endure. She fought when necessary, but she also governed with foresight. Her policies ensured that Matamba could survive even after she was gone. This dual role, warrior and governor, is what set Nzinga apart. She was not simply reacting to Portuguese aggression, she was shaping a sustainable kingdom that could exist in a hostile world. By the time she reached her later years, Nzinga had reigned for decades, proving herself not only on the battlefield, but also as a ruler who gave her people identity, resilience, and pride. She had turned exile into sovereignty, instability into governance, and despair into defiance. Nzinga was no longer just the queen of a single kingdom. She'd become the embodiment of African sovereignty itself. Nzinga's resistance was more than the defense of a kingdom. It became a symbol of defiance against one of history's greatest crimes. In every raid she repelled, in every alliance she forged, and in every negotiation where she refused to bow, she was striking at the very heart of the slave trade. The Portuguese sought Angola as one of their richest sources of captives for the transatlantic system. Every year, thousands were dragged in chains to Luanda, branded and loaded onto ships bound for Brazil. Each departure meant entire villages emptied, cultures shattered, and families erased. For many of those who suffered, Nzinga's presence offered hope. Her territory became a refuge for fugitives. Escaped captives knew that if they could reach her lands, they would not be handed back to the Portuguese. Instead, Nzinga granted them freedom, shelter, and in many cases, a place in her army. In this way, her resistance was not abstract. It was lived reality, real lives saved from the holds of ships, real futures reclaimed from bondage. Her fight disrupted the Portuguese system. Every alliance she brokered and every battle she won slowed the flow of captives to Luanda. For the slave traders, her campaigns meant fewer profits, greater risks, and the constant threat of rebellion. For the enslaved, her defiance was a flicker of hope in a world consumed by despair. Stories of Nzinga's courage spread far beyond her kingdom. Among her people, she was revered as the protector chosen by the ancestors, the queen who refused to yield to European greed. To her enemies, she became a figure both feared and begrudgingly respected. Even Portuguese chroniclers, hostile though they were, acknowledged her brilliance, recording with unease how a woman they had tried to dismiss again and again continued to outwit their empire. Nzinga's resistance was not flawless, nor was it without compromise. At times, she traded captives herself, using the harsh realities of her world as bargaining chips to secure weapons or concessions. To modern eyes, this complicates her story. Yet it also reveals the impossible dilemmas she faced. In a world consumed by slavery, she navigated a path where survival often demanded grim choices. Her determination, however, remained consistent: to protect as many of her people as she could and to deny Portugal complete control over Central Africa. Over the decades, Nzinga transformed from a queen defending her throne into a living symbol of freedom. To those enslaved, she represented resistance. To those free but threatened, she was hope. And to those who came after, she became a legend, a reminder that even in an age when Africa was under siege, courage and dignity could not be erased. Her life was proof that Africans did not submit passively to slavery, as some narratives later claimed. They fought, they resisted, they adapted. And at the center of that defiance stood a queen who had made her very name to twist, to turn, into a philosophy of survival. In her later years, Nzinga's life became a testament to endurance. She had fought the Portuguese for decades, adapting to every betrayal, every setback, every shift in fortune. By the time she entered her 60s, many would have expected her to fade from the battlefield and retire into ceremonial rule. Instead, Nzinga remained at the center of the struggle, still commanding armies, still leading negotiations, still refusing to surrender her people's freedom. The challenges grew heavier with time. The Portuguese never abandoned their goal of breaking her power. Their forces, though often humiliated, continued to return, backed by endless resources from Brazil and Europe. Rivals at home remained a threat as well, for not all neighboring rulers shared her determination. Some saw cooperation with the Portuguese as the easier path, while others resented Nzinga's dominance over Matamba. In such a world, every alliance could dissolve overnight, every friendship could turn into betrayal. Yet, Nzinga did not yield. Even in her 70s, she was known to address her troops in armor, rallying them before battle with words of fire. For younger warriors who had grown up hearing her legend, the sight of the queen herself on the field was a force stronger than any weapon. She had become the living embodiment of resistance, the proof that age and exhaustion could not defeat will. Diplomacy remained as important to her as war. In her later years, she sought peace, not from weakness but from calculation. She opened new negotiations with the Portuguese, carefully weighing terms that could preserve her kingdom without sacrificing her people to total domination. By then, both sides understood that Nzinga could not be crushed. Her survival was proof of her brilliance. The Portuguese began to see that dealing with her was preferable to endless, costly wars they could not win. When Nzinga finally passed away in 1663, she was nearly 80 years old, a remarkable age in a time of violence, disease, and constant upheaval. Her death marked the end of an era. For decades, she had been the shield of her people, and her absence left a fragile vacuum. Matamba would continue as a kingdom, but none who followed her could match her genius or her unyielding will. Still, Nzinga's legacy outlived her. She was remembered not only as a queen, but as a warrior who had defied one of the greatest empires of her age. For the Portuguese, she remained a figure of grudging respect, a leader who had forced them into concessions when they expected only submission. For her people, she became a legend, her name carried in songs and stories long after her passing. Nzinga's later years remind us that resistance is not only measured in victories, but in survival. She had faced the relentless machinery of empire and lived to old age, still sovereign, still unbroken. Few rulers in her time, male or female, African or European, could claim the same. Long after her death, Nzinga's story continued to travel. Among her own people, she was remembered in songs, proverbs, and oral traditions as the queen who refused to kneel, the woman who turned cunning and courage into weapons against a seemingly unstoppable empire. Mothers told their children of how she faced the Portuguese governor on equal terms, how she created a refuge for the displaced, how she fought on battlefields into her old age. For them, Nzinga was not simply a figure of history. She was a symbol of what it meant to resist. Her memory spread beyond Angola. In the centuries that followed, enslaved Africans carried fragments of her story across the Atlantic. In Brazil and the Caribbean, whispers of African queens who had fought the Portuguese became part of the spiritual resistance of those in bondage. Nzinga represented the possibility that slavery was not destiny, that freedom had been defended by leaders who would rather die than surrender. In modern times, her image has grown even larger. During the 20th century, as African nations fought for independence from colonial rule, Nzinga was reborn as an icon of liberation. Angolan revolutionaries in particular invoked her name, seeing in her defiance the same spirit that fueled their struggle against Portuguese colonialism centuries later. Statues were raised in her honor, and her story was taught not only as history, but as inspiration. She has also become a global symbol. Across the African diaspora, Nzinga's name is spoken with reverence alongside other great figures of Black resistance. For feminists, she embodies the truth that leadership and strength are not confined to men, that in the harshest of worlds, a woman could wield power with unmatched brilliance. For Pan-Africanists, she stands as a reminder that African history is filled with heroes who resisted foreign domination. For all who look to the past for courage, she represents the unbroken will of a people. Even in popular culture, Nzinga's legacy continues to echo. Novels, plays, and films reimagine her life, each seeking to capture the fire that allowed her to outwit an empire. Historians study her not only as a warrior, but as a stateswoman whose strategies reveal the complexity of African responses to colonial expansion. She is no longer just a figure of local memory. She belongs to world history as one of the greatest leaders of her time. The global impact of Nzinga's story lies in its ability to bridge centuries. She lived in an age when European empires believed they could consume Africa without resistance. Yet, she proved them wrong. And centuries later, when colonialism once again sought to strip Africa of its freedom, her spirit returned to inspire another generation. Nzinga endures because she represents more than a single kingdom or a single struggle. She represents the universal fight for dignity against oppression, the refusal to accept injustice as fate, the courage to stand tall when the world demands submission. Her story is not only Africa's, but humanity's. Her story does not end with her death, nor even with the independence struggles that invoked her name centuries later. Queen Nzinga's legacy lives on as a mirror held up to our present world, reminding us of what it means to resist oppression and to claim dignity against overwhelming odds. She fought in a time when the transatlantic slave trade was devouring Africa, tearing millions from their homes, and yet she refused to accept that fate as inevitable. That refusal alone made her extraordinary, but her brilliance in leadership, diplomacy, and strategy transformed her into something more, a symbol whose meaning still resonates today. Remembering Nzinga matters because her life dismantles myths. For generations, colonial narratives painted Africa as passive, a continent of victims who submitted to European domination. Nzinga shatters that illusion. She was proof that Africans resisted fiercely, that they strategized, adapted, and fought back with every weapon available. She embodies the truth that history is not simply a record of conquest, but also of survival. She also challenges us to think about freedom itself. Nzinga lived in a world where compromise was often unavoidable, where the line between survival and collaboration could blur. Her choices were not always easy to celebrate, yet they reveal the impossible dilemmas faced by leaders caught in the jaws of empire. In that complexity lies her humanity, and it is in her humanity that her greatness shines brightest. For Angola, she remains a national hero, her name honored in monuments and memory. For Africa, she is a mother of resistance, proof of a proud legacy too often silenced. For the global Black diaspora, she is a beacon, a reminder that even in the darkest centuries of slavery, there were voices of defiance, leaders who stood tall, and victories that could not be erased. To tell the story of Queen Nzinga is to reclaim a chapter of history that empire tried to bury. It is to remind ourselves that resistance has always existed, that dignity can survive even in chains, and that leadership can come from those whom history tries to overlook. Her life is a warning to oppressors and a light to the oppressed. Centuries have passed, but her message remains as urgent as ever. No empire is invincible, no injustice eternal, and no people too powerless to fight for freedom. In remembering Nzinga, we remember that courage can twist the course of history, and that the will to resist is stronger than the chains meant to break it.